Hey folks, Tim Newman with Lite Studios, and it's time for another daily assignment. Today's assignment, July 5th, 2019. If you did yesterday's July 4th assignment and you shot some fireworks scenes as a part of that assignment, you probably did some exposure compensation. Now, you may have done that exposure compensation manually by looking at your preview screen and manually adjusting the exposure until it looked pleasing to you, but you likely did exposure compensation all the same. And really, quite frankly, about 1/3 of the time when I'm out shooting, I'm doing exposure compensation as well. So today's assignment is compensating. Your camera meter, as powerful as it may be, as many features as your camera may offer in its metering systems, and hey, by the way, feel free to read the manual that came with that camera, can still make mistakes from time to time. It can be prone to either underestimating or overestimating the light that it sees in the scene in front of it. And the way that we deal with that over or underestimation of light is by using the histogram to evaluate our scenes while we're out shooting. If you're not using your histogram while you're shooting in the field, you certainly should be. Check out doing that while you're taking pictures. So, go out today, capture some images around you, and make sure that you are looking at your histogram and using your camera's exposure compensation feature. Let's take a look at a couple of sample images to get an idea of what we're talking about. In this first sample image, believe it or not, the camera metered this scene incorrectly. It saw this scene as not being quite as bright as it would have liked it to have been, and because it did that, it added in over a stop of additional light to the scene. And that light was too much. It would have blown out some of the highlights. So we used our exposure compensation feature to take a stop of that light back out, basically telling the meter, we understand what you're seeing, but we want you to deal with the light accordingly. In this next sample image, even though this image looks like it might be considered a high-key image, a lot of the foliage in the background and the fur of the horse is dark, and it leads to an image that is more than 50% dark, averaged across the scene overall. And when the camera sees that, it says, hey, this scene's a little too dark. I would like to add in a couple of stops of light. And when we see that in the histogram, we realize that those specular highlights in the background and that white on the horse's nose are likely to be blown out. So we go ahead and take those 2 stops of exposure back out. All right, let's think a little bit about the elements of design here. Hey, all of them. Those are the ones we're going to think about. Those are the elements of design that we care about here. Don't take anything off the table in these pictures. Consider them all. Okay, back to another sample picture. Again, here's another scene that's tricky for the camera to evaluate. It is essentially a dark foreground without a whole lot of light in it, and there's a lot of light in that background. And the camera's meter typically has a difficult time in dealing with those scenes that have darker foregrounds and lighter backgrounds. It's what we call silhouette lighting. And in this case, if we had left the camera alone, we would have ended up with a scene that in the foreground was just a tad underexposed. Not underexposed enough to make a silhouette, but underexposed enough to make that unnaturally dark. Now, we don't want that necessarily. A silhouette may be what we'd like here, but if we were going to do that, we would definitely purposely underexpose and take out another 3 or 4 stops in exposure compensation. But because we don't want that silhouette and we don't want that kind of murky underexposure in the underside of the pergola here, we just bump up a little bit in exposure compensation, still making sure that we're not blowing out the sky, but getting a reasonably balanced exposure in this image. In our next example, here's another scene that's a little bit deceptive. If we think about some of the sky, certainly the mountain range, the roof of the barn, the shadows in the fencing, and the foreground, this is a scene that has a lot of dark tones in it. And accordingly, the meter in the camera would take and add a couple of stops of light to this picture, rendering it a little bit overexposed. We went ahead and knocked that 2 stops of light back out, bringing our exposure back down and giving us a real nice set of tonality in this image. Our last example here is the classical white snow scene. Now, granted, this isn't a white snow scene. In fact, it was taken on the beautiful, sunny, warm island of Santorini in Greece, but it's the same scenario. It's a scene that's bright and all white. And typically when the meter in your camera sees that, it says, hey, too much light, knock off a stop or 2 of light here, leading us to those kind of murky gray exposures that we typically experience when we don't override the camera's exposure mode in snow. In this case, we know that's going to happen. We say, let's go ahead and dial a stop of 2 or light back in here with our exposure compensation, and we get this nicely exposed scene that you see here. Now, of course, the trick here is don't add in too much exposure, don't blow out the details or the texture here, but that's what we're doing. We're compensating for the meter's inability to deal with all that light. And by the way, don't you dare use that stick snowman exposure mode on your camera. You understand when you see a scene that's all white that you know that you have to use that exposure compensation to put that light back in. That'll make you a much better photographer in the long run. Let's go and take a look at some of the rules of composition that are going to matter to us here. Rules of thirds are always important here. It's a nice way to divide up the scene. Think about your point of view that you're using with your picture. If you reflect back for a moment on that scene with the Greek windows, we're lined up perfectly with the center of those windows, allowing them to really have a great sense of perspective in the screen. Don't forget balance as well. A lot of times it's geometric balance, but sometimes it's subject balance or tonal balance, but all of those things really lend themselves well to the image. All right, let's wrap up with our typical rules that we have here for uploading images. If you'd like to have any of your images considered for our semi-monthly critique, please use the following guidelines to create and export your image files, using the naming standards that you see here on this slide. And then right there at the bottom is the upload URL. Remember, you don't have to type all that gobbledygook. We always put the link for the upload right in the description below the video, which handily enough is right next to the area where you can hit the subscribe button and stay up to date with the daily assignments as Softlight Studios brings them to you. All right, we're done here, but don't forget, learning equals skills. Practice equals mastery. We'll see you out there.